Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Suk-jong Lee from Seoul, Korea, and I am one steering committee member of WMD and also professor at Sungkyunkwan University. And I'm going to moderate today's discussion called Bringing Democratic Transitions Back on Track. In 2018, steering committee decided to hold the 10th assembly under the theme of democratic transition. We were very much optimistic at the time because there is a sort of wave of democratic transition around the world. For example, from April to May, early May, in Armenia, there was a Belgrade revolutions ending 20 years of rule by the Republican Party of Armenia. And also in Malaysia, the decade rule, very dominant UMNO party lost election because of big corruption scandal. And also a year earlier, there was a democratic transition in Ecuador. So it was a very good moment to think about. However, 2-3 years have passed since 2018. And we are hearing there are many challenges these three countries are facing. So to identify, what's the major issues and how we can the international community concerning about the democracy, how can it assist more stable and solid transition to consolidate democracy. So for that purpose, we have great speakers from each country. Let me introduce Heikui Harutunian. She is a human rights defender and lawyer and currently serving as chair of the Corruption Prevention Commission of the Republic of Armenia. She previously led the Protection of Rights Without Borders, one of the most influential human rights organizations in Armenia. She's also a member of a steering committee of the Eastern Partnership Civil Society Forum from 2016 to 2019. It's good to have a Heikui. Okay, our second speaker is Mauricio Alarcon. He is the executive director of the Fundación Claudania y Desalolo. I hope I am pronouncing right. The National Contact for Transparency International in Ecuador. He was an alternative member of the National Constituent Assembly and a constitutional advisor to the Council for Citizen Participation. He's a consultant for national and international organizations on issues related to human rights. And our third speaker is Ibrahim Ben Sofian. He is an entrepreneur and innovator in the public polling sector of Malaysia. He co-founded the Merdeka Center for Opinion Research in year 2004. The center has become a central player in Malaysian national politics by improving the quality of public debate and widening public participation in the political process. Thank you, everyone, to participate in this great discussion. My first question is updating what has been going on over the 2-3 years after the initial democratic transition. Let me start with Heikui. You had a great Velvet Revolution in the year 2018, but I think we are hearing you are facing some difficulty, especially with the recent ceasefire agreement with Azerbaijan. I think you lost some territory, and that was a very emotional shock. And also your government appears to be less popular because of this loss. So Heikui, why don't you update what's going on in your country?
Thank you. Thank you so much for making me part of this very important event and allowing myself to share the progress about the country and democracy in the country. So basically, in April of 2018, people of country, Armenia, stood up against the regime that has been imposed on us almost 30 years and rejected the further government of the same regime in the country by announcing that public will continue to govern the state from that point. It was one of the largest movements, not only in the Armenia, but also in the region during that time. After the experience that we have heard and seen in Ukraine, Georgia, as people's movement that has turned the existing government and regime. And from that point, Armenia entered into the new phase of development towards democracy. So the new government has been formed late January of 2019, and then kind of started developing extended reform agendas in a number of areas, including judiciary, but also underlining the fight against corruption. As you have mentioned, unfortunately, this process has been also challenged by a number of external factors. So in September, the protest started by the COVID and pandemic that has been spread in all over the world. But for us, as a very fragile democratic process going on in country, it had more negative effects. So the new formed government had to fight against it as a kind of crisis management task for themselves, but at the same time trying to keep that reform agenda ongoing and performing whatever there was initially put as a part of this reform process. And then in September of the same year, 2020, the long-standing conflict with Azerbaijan has been escalated. Actually, it was an attack from the side of Azerbaijan on territories that already have been populated by Armenians and Christian population. And then this war lasted more than 40 years and resulted in territorial loss from Armenian side, unfortunately, which was really painful. So people had been moved from the places they are living more than 20 years. The houses were burned. So it was really very painful process and created very severe consequences also for this new government, where we have already facing a number of challenges. And now with these consequences of the war, discussions around democracy and around the reform agenda seem to be no important anymore. But of course, as public will have already demonstrated that no, the country has the future towards democracy. After some months, painful months, people again stood. And currently there will be snap elections right on 20th of June. Where hopefully the final decision on the internal sustainability and the future of the country will be decided, and the new government will very clearly draw the path towards democracy, again announcing that Armenia has only the future with the rule of law and strong democracy in the country. And hopefully this will again bring us back to the point where we kind of demonstrated that strong will in 2018.
Thank you very much, Heikui, for updating what has been going on in your country. And I wish all the best for the continuous successful transition to further consolidation of democracy in your country. Okay, then let's go to Ecuador. Actually, I didn't know much about Ecuador democratic history, so I read some. I think your military has some internal conflict. Anyway, you had the election, recent elections, but it looks like it was very close, but at the end, the conservative leader won the election. So I'm curious whether the reform will continue or will be better by changing to more rightist government from the leftist. So Mauricio, why don't you educate us?
Good morning to everyone. And first of all, I want to thank the World Movement for Democracy for inviting me to this panel. And it's a pleasure to share this dialogue with Sugyeong, Aikui, and Ben. I would like to tell you that the 2017 elections by themselves did not represent an opportunity for the country. We must remember that the candidate who won 4 years ago, after a very questioned electoral process, was Lenin Moreno, the former vice president of Rafael Correa. As you mentioned, Ecuador is not well known abroad about what was happening here, but Rafael Correa ruled the country from 2007 to 2017 in a very authoritarian way. The first months of Moreno's government in 2017 made us fear the worst because his ministers were appointed by Correa, and even his first acts showed us a continuity of what we lived between 2007 and 2017. What happened next, just a few months after, to call it somehow, was like a political miracle. The breakdown between Moreno and Correa was something unexpected. Nobody saw it coming. Everything seemed to indicate that Moreno realized that he had been used just to justify the need for Correa to return to power through indefinite re-election. So then he decided to take his own course, put an end to Correísmo, Correa's regime, and to implement actions aimed at recovering democracy and institutions. Personally, Sugyeong, I do not believe that Lenin Moreno's 4 years in power have been really positive. But we must recognize that there were some actions, such as overthrowing the definite re-election that was pulled by Rafael Correa through a constitutional change, or even a positive action like the one that through a popular consultation, he changed the authorities that were part of Correa's hyper-presidentialism. Those actions were definitely good. But there's a big difference with what recently happened on April, in which Ecuadorians finally opted for a change by electing Guillermo Lasso, the leader you mentioned, because it's a different political party, it's a different ideology, it's a different proposal. But above all, I personally think that there is an opportunity to implement real actions for the recovery of democracy, the rule of law, and the institutions. And of course, many challenges have been revealed. Much of what Lenin Moreno said was nothing more than a speech without concrete actions. There are enormous challenges in the fight against corruption, institutional strengthening, or the recovery of democracy. But above all, there's a great challenge to show the country that a different government model can bring benefits for all, especially when we are right now experiencing an economic insecurity, unemployment, and health crisis. In these 4 years that just started on May 24, there is an opportunity for Guillermo Lasso and for the Ecuadorians to put an end to the division and polarization that during 14 years has done us so much damage. There is a huge challenge, but also a great opportunity to recover democracy and to get our country back to the democratic path.
Thank you, Mauricio. I wish the best for your new leader, Mr. Lasso. Now let's turn to Malaysia, the country I'm more familiar with. Ben, in 2018, when I was in Senegal, and we were very happy about the turnaround to the new party led by the former Prime Minister Mahathir, and he became Prime Minister again. But 2 years later, October 2020, and UMNO became a ruling party again. And I'm reading from the newspaper that the coalition government led by UMNO is calling for snap election. So it's a little bit confusing. So why don't you tell us about the recent political change in Malaysia?
Thank you, Suk-Jung, and also thank you to the WMB for having me on this panel. It is indeed a privilege and a pleasure to be here. So just to quickly go into your questions, the 2018 election was in many ways a perfect storm. A lot of the factors that underpin the fall of dominant parties was evident there. So I think it is in some ways a textbook example of when you have an ingrained democratic culture having regular elections. You have political parties that are established for a long period of time there. You also have what precipitated the change was splits in the ruling party. You mentioned, Dr. Mahathir, former prime minister, split from the ruling party of UMNO and then eventually joined the opposition. It was not just him, but other leaders as well. And then we had an economic problem arising from high cost of commodities, and then the endemic corruption brought about by the 1MDB scandal. So all of that, in many ways, was a perfect storm that pushed voters over the edge and voted out a party that has been in government for 61 years. But because it was such a perfect storm, in a sense, a political tsunami of sorts, it papered over, it glossed over the fundamental cleavages that underpin nation politics. And so while there was an initial euphoria of change and reform in the country, the fundamental differences that kept people apart was still there. And in time, the opposition of that period mobilized themselves and consolidated their position and began to build resistance towards the newly elected democratic government. And so now, nearly 2 years since, or rather 3 years since the election, and over a year since the change that was brought about by the old ruling party, the opposition, the party that lost the election, along with defectors from the ruling party of 2018, cobbled together and formed a new government by themselves through this very elite backdoor arrangement. So without elections, they basically crossed over, something like what happened in Israel a few days ago. So we see this happening. And so, but yet these parties have a very slim majority in parliament. It is an unstable government. And the old party, UMNO, they want to lead again. They want to supply the prime minister. They want to take leadership position in the country. And so are agitating towards having elections take place. What's holding them back is the state of emergency that we currently have, parliament that does not sit. And so today, even literally today, this afternoon, the country's rulers, we have traditional rulers that the king and his other rulers had a conference today, and they will determine, I think, the course of what to do next. So the rulers have recommended that the parliament convene, and this opens up a Pandora's box of whether this government will stand the test of confidence or not. So we are in very uncertain times in Malaysia, and I think we look ahead, it is very likely that we will have an election within 12 months, and in that election, we will have new compromises, realignment of the political parties along new coalitions.
Okay, based on what I'm hearing now is that in 3 countries which are in the middle of a democratic transition, there is no stable and solid political party or political leadership who can, steer this very challenging path of consolidations. And around the world, many countries are facing difficulties. Sometimes they just roll back to authoritarian past because the maintaining this sustainable transition is so challenging. I think one good example is Myanmar, and the military. It was packed democracy between democratic force and the military power. So it is very tragic that the coup d'état just oppressed so many people and killed more than 800 people. And if you go to Tunisia, and our friend in the steering committee from Tunisia talked to me that the economic development is a challenge. Even though they transited to more democratic government, this economic stagnation was very difficult to manage. So he once asked me how South Korea managed successful economic development and also democratizations. And if you go to other part of the world, like Ukraine, Sudan, and Mali, corruption seems to be a big issue as well. Then how civil society and civil society organizations in your country address these key challenges and how they want to and try to protect the fragile transition to move forward. So let me invite Hei Kui first again.
Thanks so much. This is very much important, and also gives me the opportunity to go back and also kind of now preview the history and what I personally played that time as a part of civil society. So as I mentioned, change of the regime in the country happened because of number of issues, but as other colleagues also mentioned, this systemic or endemic corruption that has been so well rooted across the government and oligarchic governance regime were so much there for this period of time, and that hurt the citizens, but also the entire structure of the government. And because of that, the education system has been weakened, the economy was very weak, and a number of other internal issues demonstrated already that the continuation of the same system has no place anymore. And with that demand, people stood up, and myself, as being part of civil society at that time, I also participated in the movement serving for those who were detained and suppressed. So I spent all that time in police stations trying to help those who were captured and brought to the police stations. And then after, when the new government has been formed, the civil society was so much supportive. Like there was that consensus and understanding that this is a new page and era for the country, and we should be supportive, keeping process to go on. And because of that, I think with that understanding, number of colleagues from civil society joined to the government, because there was this huge demand, but also task for everyone to make that reform really happen, to kind of clean judiciary, to clean the system from systemic corruption. And those who had relevant capacities, but also that eager of doing something more for the country, joined to the government. And for myself, that was also a kind of decision that I took. In late November of 2019, I myself decided to take the public position, but it's kind of different position. I did not join to the government as a part of kind of cabinet of ministers, etc. This Corruption Prevention Commission has been established as a very new institution with an extended mandate to fight, but also prevent reoccurrence of the systemic and endemic corruption in the country. And I decided to try to merge my capacities acting and serving as a human rights lawyer more than 15 years, but also having that capacity of policy making and well understanding about the government system. I decided to bring my knowledge, capacities, but also ability to build the institution. Because for myself, there was very much obvious that after the change in the government, number one challenge will be sustaining the process through the institutions. But unfortunately, in the countries like Armenia, as a post-Soviet country also, the state institutions have been undermined. The content was not there to really protect the interest of people, but also the government's interest as a organization. Everything has been created just to serve for the group of oligarchs and for the group of those who were that period of time taking the power. So bringing the concept of the rule of law, not rule of person or individual working anymore in the country was number one task for myself. And then I decided that I'm building the state institution, the strong one, who can further resist against systemic corruption, but also support the government to clean that much corrupted system. And of course, number of challenges are there. Number one, if I list, will be that old kind of bureaucratic system and mid-class bureaucrats who traditionally do not like changes and especially the kind of radical reforms. And now we are facing so much strong resistance coming from that mid-class that anything that the Commission is entitled to bring as a new concept for the country is getting so much criticized. And also that presents also that old guys are still so much present there. So of course, this change is for people, but those who were in power, they will not give up that much easily. Now they have their shadow governments, but also influence on the processes that are going on in the country, trying to regain power and bring the old regime, as you mentioned, that authoritarian regime back to the country. But in Armenian case, this is also so much affected by the external factors. We have spoken already about the war, and I guess many people know also that these regions, South Caucasus, where Armenia, Georgia, mostly Azerbaijan presented, are so much affected by Russian influence. And currently, when all over the world, there is this kind of discussion that Russia brings this authoritarian regime, but also so much is aligned with the government system, which is very much corrupt. Of course, having that much strong influence in the region, but also in Armenia, because of the war and the consequences, creates additional difficulties for us to make this fight against corruption really successful in a way that internal sustainability of the country, but also sovereign government is created within the country that can lead also other countries in the region towards democracy, making that strong coalition, regional coalition. But we are trying to overcome that kind of challenges with the support of international partners and those who already succeeded kind of and achieved a path towards democracy, but also succeeded with this fight against systemic corruption. Very recently, I and my colleague, we have been in Ukraine trying to understand the kind of development in Ukraine and that kind of cooperation that we have built within institutions, another opportunity that supports us to overcome the existing challenges within the country and within our work. but number of initiatives also are taken by ourselves. For example, the latest one that I personally feel that is very much going to support to end this systemic but also political corruption in the country is that we have already established a system of financial supervision of the political party funding systems, but also the funding members of the political parties are becoming declarant and accountable for their investments in the party, but also for the further processes.
Okay, thank you. Heikuye, I think you are the perfect example of a crossover, but that topic we are going to discuss more at the end. I think the kind of a crossover individual participation is important, but in the case of South Korea, I think rapid organization of civil society after democratic transition was critical. So all those CSOs were pressing the government to introduce a series of reform like real name account in banking, and also you have to use your real name when you're trying to buy land, and also putting the purging the political military. That kind of rapid reform was very important in the case of South Korea. Okay, Mauricio, what about in your country to fight against this 14 years of Correa and Moreno rule? Your country is introducing this kind of legal and institutional reform?
First of all, I want to mention something that you said during the introduction of this segment. When a transition is not successful, people even begin to miss authoritarianism, and we must focus on that. In Ecuador, that's what happened recently. It's not an exception. Correa's candidate not only won the first round of elections this year, but also narrowly won the presidency. So he was really close to bring authoritarianism back to the country. And about your question, Sugyun, in Ecuador, civil society played a very important role during the most critical stage. During Correa's government, which persecuted and threatened activists, or even closed NGOs around the country, many of us learned how to resist, based of course on successful experiences from our partners from Venezuela or Bolivia. We learned how to denounce what was happening in the country. We learned how to propose changes. Our criticism was always presented with a proposal. Our denouncements were based on data, on facts, not on opinions. But not all leading members of civil society followed that path. Many activists and organizations unfortunately preferred to play the game of the dictatorship, working for it, or laying low. Those of us who resisted are the ones who, as of 2017 and until today, had the legitimacy to propose reforms. As I mentioned before, the breakdown between Correa and Moreno was an opportunity to start fighting for change. On one hand, we had to work to disarm a corrupt structure that concentrated power for its own benefit, a structure that stole billions of dollars from Ecuadorians, a structure that disrespected the Constitution and the law. We had to promote electoral reforms to improve representativeness, to make politics transparent, to depoliticize the electoral authority. We had to propose reforms to recover the rule of law and the institutions. Civil society that did not lower its guard was able to, for example, demand President Moreno's government to join OGP, the Open Government Partnership, to join EITI, the Extractive Industries Initiative for Transparency, or to improve public procurement through the open contracting standards. We knew the process would not be easy, but we have to do it. And on the other hand, from Moreno's government, there was openness. The divorce between civil society and the government was over during those years. We were no longer the enemy. Spaces for dialogue, co-creation, and constructive criticism were opened. And although civil society and organizations like mine were very hurt by what we had experienced during the 10 years of Correa's government, we work based on our principles to formally begin a process of democratic reconstruction. But the most important thing, Sugyun, was we realized that civil society should continue working together, not only resisting together, in the same way it used to be, overcoming differences. Each one, from its experience and ability, would lead a process that would be supported by others. Initiatives in a democratic transition could not be submitted individually. Collective work was definitely the only option.
Thank you, Mauricio. Okay, now let's move to Ben. Ben, after all, the former Prime Minister, Razak, he was tried because of his involvement in one MDB scandal. And after this scandal, how about the corruption in Malaysia? Is it being reduced, or is it still there are many corrupted politicians in your country?
Yeah, I think the experiences in Malaysia mirror that of what Hekui has mentioned, as well as what Mauricio has mentioned, that we can never underestimate the influence and the resources wielded by very powerful corrupt leaders and the following that they have built up. And in the context of Malaysia, when you have a ruling party that has been there for more than 6 decades, their followers not just exist in the political space, but they also have strong supporters in the state apparatus, the administration, and also branches of government. So while the government had changed in 2018 and these corrupt leaders were taken to trial, they continued to mobilize public opinion in their favor. And so while Najib Razak, has already been convicted and is undergoing subsequent cases, court cases, he still commands sizable amount of support. He still indirectly controls UMNO, that one of the component parties of the ruling government. So this is a lesson that democratic transition needs to be far-reaching and needs to prepare for the long road. So because the leaders that are there, they are not just as individuals, but they represent a system that they have captured over many, many years. In the context of countries like Malaysia, I suppose we have a very strong executive that has strong influence over the state power. And so they have continued to be able to influence public opinion and others. With respect to the question of corruption, I think there has been a change in the sense that we do not have new reports of grand corruption of the scale that we have witnessed with the Najib Razak scandal. So we have not encountered any of that. But the rumors and the talk among bureaucracy, there is still some elements of this going on, but no longer at the scale that has transpired before. Secondly, people have become more educated about this in the sense that they are looking out for these issues. And number three, I think the important lesson from the democratic transition is that a lot of political leadership now understand that they cannot get away with abuses of power and corruption with impunity, that there might be a possibility of them losing power and that they will be held to account for the conduct of themselves during government. So I think that's an important lesson where people need to remind themselves. I think fourth point is the encouragement on the part of civil society. Although Malaysian civil society is small and tends to be under-resourced, the success of that 2018 election has mobilized people to understand that these are the parameters of having good government. So people are becoming more and more aware about the need to have transparency and accountability in government. It is going to be a very tough fight, but I think the public awareness has been built up. So there is pressure and support from members of the public. I think the final point I want to bring in the conversation is that the changes in technology and access to information that has made the work of civil society significantly easier. And we find that in the context of Malaysia, because we do need to have regular elections, it has been ingrained and it's part of the national political culture to have elections. Leaders and political parties cannot behave with impunity. So they know that at some point in time, they will need to seek re-election and to have legitimacy. And so they cannot punish dissenters too hard. So while we do have critics of the government occasionally being arrested or detained, we find that the level of harshness towards government critics have diminished significantly over the last several years. And in part is because even the apparatus itself, the bureaucracy or the security people also understand that at some point the government may change. And so they just better behave in accordance with the law. So that I think has been the lesson learned here in Malaysia that could be perhaps emulated in other countries in transition.
Yeah, I think I'm glad that Ben has mentioned the kind of technical innovation helps to reduce corruption with the digital government administration. I think the space to get corrupted has been very much reduced. So I think in the case of South Korea, after democratization, the big corruption has been reduced, and citizens are very much demanding for the very transparent and very high level of integrity for public officials. But I think in our case, power abuse is still important case because as Ben has mentioned, Asian states government is very strong as a legacy of a developmental state. So they have a very strong regulatory power vis-a-vis business. So therefore, the business leaders tend to, it's not just providing money, it's more like accommodating kind of a policy corporations from president or the important political leader. So that's not that's not helping the transparent and fair market competition. So that's more serious issue in the case of South Korea. Okay, so let's move to other issue. That's how we can manage the people's expectation during the transition time. It's very typical that when a country is being democratized, the people has a very high expectation to achieve politically and economically. But it's such we need time to introduce a series of reform, but people, they don't. So that's why, as Mauricio has mentioned, some segment of a society is missing the authoritarian past. That's very dangerous sign. We hear, like many survey, for example, in Tunisia, the 87% of Tunisians think the country is heading in a wrong direction after the successful transition. And also, Ben has mentioned in Malaysia too, actually people's public opinion was worse during the 2 years Mahathir year and get better after UMNO took power again in October 2020, in March 2020. Well, so how can we help the public understand that it takes time to show democratic dividends while showing the public some quick tangible gains. So can we just divide what can be quick gains so people can be assured, wow, democratizing is good. But at the same time, there's some kind of areas and issues we have to persuade them, you've got to be patient. And also these days, there are many disinformations, they try to hurt young democracy. So I'd like to hear about these issues from each country. So this case, let's start from Ben again.
Yeah, I think in the context of Malaysia, I think the our situation here is that the opposition has been contesting in 14 elections, 1-4 elections for many years, and they were not successful. And so we do notice that it's a human psychology where they try to overcompensate. And so in the 2018 election, they overpromised. They made a lot of populist promises. For example, they are going to do away with the sales tax. They wanted to forgive student loans, for example. But the moment they got into government, they found that they are not able to do all of these things, that they had a lot of constraints and there were a lot of problems. They moved into a new house and then they found that the cupboards were bare. And so they needed to take on an austerity drive instead. And so that made a lot of people who had switched from the old party, the old ruling party, to them very upset. That is one part, unmet promises. The other issue is the long-standing fundamental cleavages, the differences that underpin the politics of the country. Malaysia is a diverse country, multicultural, multi-religious country. And so the political parties actually represent different religious groups, different ethnic groups, different parts, different regions of the country. So it is an effort to have a coalition government in the country. And so in the wake of the transition, the opposition actually had majority support from the majority component of the population, and they mobilized it against the ruling party of that period. And so they quickly began to have problems. And when they tried to enact reforms, such as ratifying international conventions like anti-discrimination conventions and so on, it was met with protests by the majority population, and that quickly brought down their popularity. I think the point that I want to build here is that democratization process is a long-term work, and it needs support from all sectors of society. It needs to have a very strong civil society that not just take on specific cases, but need to take on a public education role as well, especially when you have segments of the population that have very urgent economic needs, for example, or very urgent developmental needs. How do they manage these needs as opposed to the democratization process? And therefore, there is a need to also compromise in some sense so that they can stabilize the political situation and allow for time for democracy to take root, for the reforms to deliver the dividends. I think my final point is that in the context of moving the agenda forward, having a momentum for the future, there's always a need to invest in young people. And I think the one thing that the government of 2018 was successful was that they managed to lower the voting age from 21 to 18 years old. So this brings a 40% increase in the electorate and brings young people into the voting pool. And I think it opens up Malaysian politics so that we can, I think, begin to debate and mobilize people beyond the fundamental issues of ethnicity, religion, and regional differences. So it actually opens up space for civil society to play a more active role in the future. And perhaps their leaders then can transit from civil society space to political space.
Thank you, Ben. Actually, in my country too, young people has been is very much less represented in the national parliament and in established politics. But all of a sudden, very recently, young political leader, even though he failed 3 times in general election, got elected as one of a major opposition party. So everybody got excited for young men to be a party leader. Okay, let's move to Heikui. Tell me about the very high expectation in Armenia. And after all, it's a citizens movement, right, to bring democracy. So their expectation must be very high, but are they still very supportive, or are they a little bit somewhat frustrated? If so, in what issues they are disappointed?
Thanks for this question as well. I just want quickly to contribute also in the last point Ben made about youth engagement and kind of having more young people in a government. So the new Armenian government has been so much proud that after elections, where the government has been formed and represented by so many young people. And the movement itself was so much presented by so many young people. Actually, students made a large part of the movement and organized so many events and encouraged also adults to participate and be part of the movement. So for us, it was obvious that this is somehow youth-led movement. For me, very much important to keep that balance, also engaging more young women. I think in the countries and in societies like Armenia, where men-dominated traditional governments were there more than 25, 27 years now, what I personally see that the cultural and behavioral change of society happens also just because we need to engage more young women in positions, but providing really the powerful tools, but also having very strong point that it is not just formal requirement, but the content has been should be provided as well for this. So coming to the question about the high public expectations, of course, as people's driven movement for the change and for especially for the very quick fix and quick change, there was and there is still very high public expectation. What I see personally, unfortunately, that is getting kind of less and less, that now that public ownership that has been there during the movement, I don't see personally that there is that much public ownership for the reform as well. People are waiting for a quick change, and unfortunately, new governments and like Armenian government does, they are becoming like more very much sensitive to public opinion. It should be that way, but unfortunately, that sensitivity becomes something that the kind of government tries to feed the public expectations, not with the real actions, but for creating some kind of small and quick fixes for the situations that do not ensure the sustainability, but also they are not for the long perspective. So this balance that now and currently exists in Armenia, unfortunately, affects the further reform process itself. So, for example, people were so much eager to punish those who were engaged in systemic corruption and get back the assets, but also the kind of money that these people were holding, state money, but through the legal process it was not possible. So the government started to run after all the regime representatives, and in some situations, unfortunately, the criminal cases that were initiated, were suspended, cancelled, just because the legal grounds were not enough. So this created so huge disappointment from the public side. But unfortunately, the government didn't work in parallel to create the relevant environment for society to be engaged in the reform agenda implementation, so people can see from inside what's happening and that the government is not giving up with the promises that there were there from the beginning. And the second very important aspect that affects a lot, creating disappointment from the public side for the reform, but also for the future of the country, is that the opposition, which is using so much disinformation and relying on the social media and the channels and trying to manipulate the understanding of people. So instead of to use all these relevant instruments and the mechanism to engage people in implementation of the reform agenda, what I see personally, that now it is used for the opposite. Now it supports the opposition and old guys to create the environment where people see and start criticizing that the current government does not do anything that they have promised in the beginning. And this disbalance that actually we are facing gets deep and deep now. And unfortunately, this public awareness rising culture is not that much very well rooted in Armenian society that could support filling that gap, but also creating really a culture where citizenship is important, not only for changing the old regime, but also building the new country. So for myself, as currently the public official, now I'm trying to find the ways how this behavioral change among citizens can happen through the awareness raising campaign, that they understand that they are part of the process of building new state, building new government, where of course abuse of power, corruption will not have place anymore for the further development.
Thank you, Yuki. And Mauricio, according to your story, I think your country, Ecuador, is more politically divided. So I'm sure there must be a group opposing new president democratic agenda. So how he can persuade and unify people and to satisfy their demand and persuade them this young democracy is worthwhile for them to watch and invest.
There's a long path and a hard work to be done. But as you mentioned something about citizen frustration and impatience, and I think that's one factor that definitely plays a key role when divided the country. And we must realize that certainly many transition processes are frustrating for citizens. Perhaps because the authorities do not understand or don't want to understand what we expect of a transition. When you are coming out of a dictatorship, you seek to recover democracy and not simply to pass power and control from one hand to another. In the Ecuadorian case, and that's why division happened, the transition that the Moreno government attempted through a popular consultation was very frustrating because it did not result in a real change or the recovery of democracy and institutions. It was simply passing the power from one hand to another. How we can put the country together, how we can join our citizens together when division is taking place. I think that if you really work to get rid of corruption, to reform the laws or to restore democracy, there's no doubt that people would not be frustrated, that people will work together to pursue those objectives. even, as I mentioned before, I have no doubts that people would join forces and support any initiative, in this case, led by the new government, by our new president. As Winston Churchill said many decades ago, democracy is the worst form of government except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. We must think about that democracy, it's reaching a limit. That democracy was used and abused by governments. There's a lot of mistrust, but there's also a lot of ignorance. And ignorance is also one of the causes of division. The best thing is to generate awareness in citizens, making them understand that although you don't eat democracy, it is thanks to democracy that we can eat. Look what's going on in Venezuela. And on the other side, thinking on the government side, it is important for them to understand that today we live in a time in which citizens are permanently informed through the internet and social networks. You mentioned disinformation and misinformation. A speech is not enough to convince people. The speech is not enough to join people back together. Citizens want to see results. We want actions, not just the speeches. Quick gains are necessary, but lasting gains are more important. Transition processes demand profound changes, not patch reforms. And to achieve these, in line, for example, with open government, the best path is not that one of the representative democracy, but the one of participatory democracy, in which citizens are involved, in which citizens participate, in which all actors and all sectors are required to achieve changes, in which it's required to listen to people and not just take decisions seated in your office. Today, the transition processes are very different from the ones the world experienced in the 70s or in the 80s. Even dictatorships and authoritarianism and totalitarianism are also different from those that, based on military clothing, were seen during those decades. I'm talking about Latin America, of course. Look right now what is happening in our region, in countries like El Salvador, in which the dictatorship hides itself in the speech of change, in which abuses of power are justified in popularity polls. The citizens' struggle is no longer for left or right ideologies. The best way of joining us back together and the struggle of true citizens is based on the promotion, the protection, and the defense on liberal democracy and liberal democratic principles. So that's the way we must push forward if we want successful democratic transitions in our countries.
Thank you very much. Well, we already spent more than an hour, so I think I have to wrap up pretty soon. Well, my key takeaways from three great speakers is that after transition, just maintaining democratic transition on right track is very important, essential for the further consolidations. And for that matter, we need a series of legal and institutional reform. And for that purpose, the continuous civil society organizations support for the democracy, and also activists themselves participation in new government is also helpful. So with that note, I'd like to end this panel. And at last, I'd like to thank you, three great speakers, Ben, Mauricio, and Heiyuki. Thank you very much. And I wish all the best to all your countries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.